Congress refuses to deal with this issue. And so Alan Greenspan set us on a course, and Ben Bernanke is following it. We're going to burn the currency. He is going to drop money out of helicopters to keep this whole thing afloat. And yes, every single baby boomer, you will get your Social Security check. And you will go to Starbucks and buy that cup of coffee for $100, and that will be the end of your Social Security check. All right? So yes, the government will do it. So our government is in the process of beginning to renege on all of the promises it has made to its citizens, going all the way back to the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's time. See, it was Herbert Hoover, Republican, and Franklin Roosevelt, Democrat, that started to get us into the mess that we're in, because they set everything up like a giant Ponzi scheme in which the cost could be rolled forward from generation to generation, and as long as there were more people on the bottom paying in, the people retiring off the top could collect. We have a problem. World War II came along, and all the GIs came home from Europe, and they were fruitful and they multiplied. All right? Well, you would be too after you've been put through 4 years of war, right? So we have this baby boom. Now we have an inverted pyramid where the Gen Xers are a much smaller number than the baby boomers on the top. This is not sustainable. You can't hold this one together. The figures just war against it. So do you think that all of these baby boomers, which are going to be the biggest voting bloc for the next 20 years till they drop dead — I shouldn't talk like that, I'm a baby boomer — do you think they're going to let this fly? The baby boomers are the first group in history that paid all of their life into Social Security from the time they started working. My parents began paying into Social Security sometime in their teens or 20s or 30s, depending on how old they were. Our generation was the first to pay into that. That's the second part of the storm. So we have an energy crisis coming. You are now looking squarely in the face of the death of Keynesian economics. Keynesianism is dying. You know, Keynes was an advisor to FDR, and he believed you could just inflate your way into oblivion. He knew, however, there was an end game for a fiat currency, which is what Ron Paul is so right about. Every fiat currency in the history of the world has died a violent death and has to be replaced by another currency. So these are some of the crises coming together, and there are jokers in the deck, because tied in with the oil crisis is the entire Middle East situation and that little wild card that's always out there about another major terrorist strike on the United States, which almost inevitably may be coming. This is all blossoming in this little window, 2009, 2012. It's like a clock. So I'm predicting by the time we get to 2012, you're going to have an American populace that is very unhappy because of what they're beginning to feel. The American people are going to feel a lot of pain. And little subsidies like they're proposing now to give everybody a check for $800 or $1,000 or whatever are not going to do anything but give a short-term goose to the economy. That's all it's going to do. Now, what's the problem with all of this? Well, see, the problem with all of this is we have a Constitution which is supposed to glue the Republic together. It has to work equally for everybody. Conservatives, liberals, wackos, sane people. It has to work for everybody, or it really doesn't work for anybody. And starting about the beginning of the 20th century, regularly various political parties would take another chunk out of the Constitution. You know, how did we get where we are? Maybe that's the next thing I could look at. I'll jump in my speech here to where I intended to go. Well, the first thing that we did is we did this little thing called the Federal Reserve Act back in 1912, 1913. The Constitution says that Congress will make no money that is not based on gold and silver. Congress understood when they first set up this Constitution, we needed to have a sound money supply anchored in something to keep political shenanigans off. The first attempt at violating that was the Second Bank of the United States when they tried to run that through Congress. And Andrew Jackson vetoed that bill on July 25th of 1832. They were back in 1912 in a meeting off the coast of Georgia on a place called Jekyll Island. You know, people like to sneer when you talk about conspiracy theory, so to speak. But these people all went down in sealed railroad cars, met in secret. They addressed each other only by their first names so that the servants would not know who they were. And that's where they concocted the whole Federal Reserve System that we have today. The Federal Reserve System, which is neither federal and has no reserves, was established by Congress. It was an end run around the Constitution. And it basically made the U.S. taxpayer the lender of last resort. So the banking system consisting of a cartel between the federal government and the Federal Reserve, could take risks, make money, deficit spend. It's all made possible by this fluid paper currency. And ultimately, the U.S. taxpayer was made the scapegoat of last resort. That was the first assault on that. The second assault on how we got where we are really started with the New Deal, principally because of the fact that in order to implement the New Deal, which was primarily unconstitutional, and FDR knew it, and so did the Supreme Court, they had to declare certain wartime emergencies, which started with the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917, was amended with what was called the Emergency War Powers in 1933. If you check in the record, both of the congressional record and in the, I'm trying to remember what it's called in the White House, when the President issue executive orders, I'm having a senior moment here, you will find that the President and the Congress regularly renew these little emergencies. You'd be surprised at all the states of emergency we have, because these states of emergency enable them to do all the social programming that FDR did and that Lyndon Johnson did, which primarily would be unconstitutional. So at that point, we began promising people all sorts of goodies and rolling money over forward and rolling the cost of that forward from generation to generation. But after we got through the Great Depression, which was a government-caused phenomenon, the recession was caused by the collapse of the market due to the burst of a bubble in 1929. But because of the political pain that the Americans were feeling, Herbert Hoover's administration began jerking and tugging on every single lever that he could find and handed that process off to FDR, who at one point they raised the income tax bracket, the top bracket, to 90%. Well, the economy had already started to recover from a cleansing, a blow-off, and a recession, and after the government got through with it, it had grown once and went down into the Great Depression. It couldn't take the abuse. If they'd left it alone, it would have recovered. But that's where we headed that way. So that was the next step. The third step was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Remember, we were going to eliminate poverty. But it never occurred to anybody at the time that a government that is big enough to give you anything you want is big enough to take everything you have to do it. All right? So here we are 40 or 50 years later. Have we solved poverty? That was the promise. No, we haven't. But that began the era of large, sprawling government. You saw departments of education and other departments formed. The bureaucracy began to multiply and grow. The government's uncontrolled consumption of money began to grow. That was the next step. Jumping to the next level, we had a little thing called the war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs were the result of the Flower Child Revolution in the 60s, which said if it feels good, do it. Drugs are wonderful. Remember Timothy Leary, LSD, the whole culture that came through at that time. Well, we did all of that, and it created a horrible drug problem. So then they came up with this little idea of what I call civil forfeiture of property. In the course of this drug war, someone thought up, hey, you know, if we can just seize the assets of drug lords, we can cut off their head and prevent them from functioning. Now, we don't want to have to go to get a criminal conviction on this, so they had to come up with some mechanism. So they said, you know what? We'll charge the money with the crime instead of charging the criminal with the crime. And because money has no rights, that will allow us to seize the property or the money, and then the owner will have to fight to get it back. And the promise was, oh no, don't worry, this is only going to be used against people who are involved in RICO type of things. Well, that didn't last very long, because once various agencies at local, state, federal levels realized they had a cash cow here of making all sorts of income, the number of forfeiture statutes just began to grow like this. And this was a heavy-duty assault on the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, not being deprived of our property without due process. There are stories, there are organizations which combat this from both the left and the right. People on the left and the right have figured, hey, wait a minute, we have a problem here. You know, you will hear stories such as one of a father. He was, I forget what he did for income, but he always got cash receipts, usually had about $2,000 a week, and he would take that to the bank, deposit it in the bank. So he gets stopped by a policeman, and more policemen nowadays are asking if they can search your vehicle. I hope you know what the answer to that should be. All right.